The underground room beneath the palace of Nineveh smelled of cedar oil and fear. Not the quick, sharp fear of soldiers facing death in battle, but something slower, colder, and more complete. The kind of fear that comes when you understand that everything you were has ended. Your name will be erased. Your body will become property. The gods you prayed to cannot reach you in this place. Carved into solid rock beneath the greatest city in the world. The walls were covered in carved pictures. Even in the dim lamplight, you could see what they showed. Kings of Assyria receiving gifts from conquered peoples. Cities burning. Prisoners being killed on wooden stakes. And everywhere, woven through these scenes of conquest, images of women kneeling, veiled, hands tied. Queens stripped of their crowns. Princesses torn from palaces. Royal daughters transformed into possessions. Listed on clay tablets alongside gold and ivory and livestock. In the center of the room stood a stone basin filled with water. The water caught the lamplight and threw dancing reflections across the ceiling. The water was not for drinking. It was not for washing in any normal sense. This was ritual purification. The process by which a woman who had been a queen, who had commanded servants and made decisions and worn the symbols of divine authority, would be transformed into something else entirely. The Assyrians had a word for it. In their record tablets, property of the palace. 3 words that erased family line and identity and everything that came before. Beside the basin stood a eunuch named Nebuchadnezzar. He was perhaps 40 years old, though his smooth face made his age hard to guess. He had been castrated as a boy after his own city fell to Assyrian conquest. He was raised in the palace to serve in the royal household. He was trained to oversee the British women's quarterswear, captured queens and foreign princesses, and the daughters of vassal kings. Lived out their remaining years in silence and shadow, he had witnessed this transformation ceremony dozens of times. But tonight was different. Tonight, the woman being prepared was not some minor princess from a small kingdom that no one would remember in 10 years. Tonight, it was the Queen of Elam herself. She stood before the basin wearing the remains of her royal clothing. Though the crown and jewels had already been stripped away, her name was written in cuneiform on a clay tablet that lay on a wooden table beside the basin. Tomorrow that tablet would be dissolved in water. The clay would return to formless mud. Her original name would disappear as though it had never existed. She would be given a new name, Belatili, Lady of the Gods. A generic title that could apply to any woman. A name that carried no memory of her homeland or her family, line, or the royal house she had been born into. What would happen to her over the following hours? The ritual that would mark her change from queen to possession was never recorded in full in Assyrian government texts. The scribes who documented everything else in careful detail, who counted jars of oil and recorded the names of horses and tracked tribute payments from distant provinces, kept careful silence about the details of these transformation ceremonies. Later sources hint at practices that violated not just the dignity of the women involved, but every principle of sacred kingship that ancient Near Eastern cultures claimed to honor. But the details remained deliberately hidden. They were recorded only in fragments. They were whispered about by servants who had witnessed things they could not fully describe. They were preserved in the archaeological record through absences and silences that historians struggle to interpret. What we know is that these ceremonies happened regularly in the underground chambers of Assyrian palaces, that they were conducted by eunuchs under the authority of the king, that they involved water and oil and incense and ritual formulas recited in Akkadian, that women who entered those chambers as queens came out as nameless property whose lives would never again be their own, and that the psychological and physical transformation was so complete that captured queens who had once commanded armies and negotiated treaties and ruled kingdoms became silent shadows who moved through palace corridors without protesting, without showing any sign of the persons they had been before. Assyrian conquest destroyed their worlds. The Assyrians who designed this system understood something that most ancient conquerors did not consciously recognize. Killing a defeated king created martyrs and resistance. Executing royal families turned them into symbols that could inspire rebellion, but transforming queens into anonymous possessions, erasing their identities, making them serve the very gods whose temples their husbands had once protected. This was degradation so complete that it destroyed not just individuals, but the legitimacy of entire dynasties. When a queen disappeared into the Assyrian palace system and never came out, when she was renamed and put to work grinding grain for temple offerings, or serving wine at royal banquets, or performing tasks that reduced her to the level of the lowest slave, it showed that the gods themselves had abandoned her, that her previous royal status had been illegitimate. That Assyrian conquest was not just military victory, but divine judgment. Tonight, as Nebuchadnezzar watched the Elamite queen standing before the purification basin, as he prepared to begin the ritual that would erase who she had been, he felt something he had not felt during previous ceremonies: pity mixed with something darker, recognition that what he was about to help carry out went beyond necessity or strategy into territory, that his own gods might judge harshly when his turn came to face their judgment. But he was a eunuch in the service of the greatest king in the world. He had no choice, and she had no choice. And what happened next would be recorded only in the memories of those present, in the silent testimony of archaeological remains discovered 2,700 years later, in the gaps and absences in Assyrian royal inscriptions that boasted about every other aspect of conquest but kept careful silence about the specific fates of captured queens. But before I tell you exactly what happened in that chamber beneath Nineveh, before I reveal what transformation rituals actually involved and why Assyrian scribes refused to document them in full, before I explain what archaeological evidence tells us about the fates of women who disappeared into the palace system and never came out, I need to take you back. I need to show you who the Assyrians were, how they built an empire that terrorized the ancient Near East for 3 centuries, what they did to the kingdoms they conquered, and why the treatment of captured queens became central to their entire system of control. If you want to understand how systematic cruelty can be justified as religious duty, how intelligent people can design institutions that destroy human dignity while claiming divine approval, how entire systems can be built around the erasure and control of women, whose only crime was being born into royal families that stood in the way of Assyrian expansion, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe right now, because what you are about to learn exists in the archaeological record and in fragmentary texts and in silences that speak louder than words. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you know about ancient Assyria, because I guarantee this story goes deeper and darker than anything you learned in school. And watch all the way to the end, because I am going to tell you what happened when Nineveh finally fell, how the tables turned, how Assyrian royal women experienced the same fate they had inflicted on others, how revenge was taken for 3 centuries of systematic cruelty. Now, let me take you back to the beginning to understand how a kingdom in northern Mesopotamia became the most feared empire the ancient world had ever seen. The Assyrian Empire rose from the city of Ashur on the Tigris River, in what is now northern Iraq. For centuries, Assyria had been a relatively minor power, overshadowed by Babylon to the south, and threatened by mountain peoples to the north and east. But beginning in the 9th century before Christ, a series of extraordinarily ambitious and ruthlessly effective kings transformed Assyria into a military machine that would conquer everything from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Iran. These kings rulers, like Ashurnasirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III, and Sennacherib and Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal built their empire through systematic terror, combined with administrative efficiency that was unprecedented. In the ancient world, they did not just conquer territories. They destroyed the psychological foundations that allowed conquered peoples to imagine resistance. They created a system where submission seemed not just militarily necessary but religiously inevitable, where the gods themselves appeared to have endorsed Assyrian dominance, where rebellions seemed not just futile but blasphemous. The military tactics were brutal, even by ancient standards. Assyrian armies practiced psychological warfare deliberately and systematically. They would surround cities for months, slowly starving populations while building siege towers and battering rams visible from the walls, letting defenders watch their doom approaching with mechanical inevitability. When cities fell, the punishment was designed to be memorable. Leaders were impaled on stakes. Populations were deported en masse to distant provinces where they would never see their homelands again. Cities were burned so thoroughly that nothing remained but ash and rubble. But the Assyrians understood that military conquest alone was not enough for building a stable empire. They needed to destroy the legitimacy of conquered dynasties, to make clear that previous rulers had lost divine favor, that their gods had abandoned them. That resistance was not just militarily hopeless, but spiritually condemned. And this is where the treatment of captured royal families, particularly queens and princesses, became central to Assyrian imperial ideology. When Assyrian armies conquered a kingdom, they did not simply kill the royal family. That would have been simpler and, in some ways, more merciful. Instead, they took the king and queen and their children captive, transporting them to Assyria, where they would serve as living demonstrations of Assyrian superiority. The defeated king might be paraded through the streets of Nineveh in chains, forced to kneel before the Assyrian king while crowds jeered. He might be kept alive for years, displayed during royal celebrations as a trophy, reminded daily that he had lost everything, including his dignity. But what happened to captured queens was different, more systematic, more designed to destroy not just individuals, but the entire concept of legitimate opposition to Assyrian rule. These women were taken to the royal palaces, particularly the great palace complexes at Nineveh and Nimrod, where they were processed through a system that transformed them from queens into anonymous property. This system, the Bit Ashiti, or women's quarters, was one of the most sophisticated instruments of control and degradation the ancient world produced. The archaeological evidence for this system comes from multiple sources. Palace reliefs carved during the reigns of various Assyrian kings show captive women in processions, often veiled and with hands bound or positioned in gestures of submission. Administrative tablets from palace archives record lists of foreign women, carefully categorized by origin and status, and assigned specific roles within the palace household. Letters between palace officials discuss the management of these women, the punishments for disobedience, the protocols for ensuring their silence and submission, and burial evidence from palace complexes shows female skeletons wearing jewelry from multiple different regions, suggesting these were women from conquered kingdoms who died in Assyrian captivity and were buried within palace grounds. But the most revealing evidence comes from what the Assyrians chose not to record. Royal inscriptions that boast an elaborate detail about military victories, about cities conquered and enemies defeated and tribute collected, keep careful silence about what happened to captured queens. After they arrived in Assyria, the scribes who documented everything else with obsessive precision simply stopped writing when it came to the specifics of how these women were processed and controlled and used. This silence is not accidental. It suggests that what happened in those palace chambers was considered either too sacred to record or too shameful to admit, even by Assyrian standards that accepted brutality as normal policy. Modern historians and archaeologists have pieced together the outlines of the system from fragments. Captured queens were taken to underground chambers in the palace complex. These chambers, carved into bedrock and accessible only through guarded passages, served as transformation spaces where women who had been royalty would be systematically broken down and rebuilt as palace property. The process involved multiple stages, each designed to remove another layer of their previous identity and replace it with the reality of their new status. The first stage was physical. Royal clothing and jewelry were removed. Hair might be cut or reshaped according to Assyrian rather than foreign custom. Bodies were washed in ritual basins using water mixed with oils and substances whose exact composition remains unknown, but that may have included intoxicants or other chemicals designed to disorient or sedate. The archaeological discovery of these ritual basins near palace areas, identified as women's quarters, suggests this was standard procedure rather than isolated practice. The second stage was nominative. The woman's original name was recorded on a clay tablet, which was then dissolved in water, literally erasing her identity. She was given a new name, typically one that referenced Assyrian gods or that was generic enough to apply to any woman. The administrative tablets that list palace women show this pattern clearly. Names like Belatili, Lady of the Gods, or Melissa Damkat, Melisu, is good appear repeatedly, suggesting these were assigned names rather than birth names. The psychological impact of losing your name, of hearing yourself called by a title that erased your family line and homeland and family, cannot be overstated. Names carried meaning in the ancient world. They connected you to ancestors, to gods, to place. Taking away a woman's name was taking away her connection to everything that had made her who she was. The third stage was occupational. Captured queens were assigned tasks that inverted their previous status. Women who had commanded servants were put to work grinding grain for temple offerings. Women who had been served elaborate meals prepared food for others. Women who had worn royal regalia wove cloth for palace use. The point was not economic. The Assyrian palace had plenty of slaves for routine labor. The point was psychological. Making a former queen perform menial tasks demonstrated that her previous status had been illegitimate, that the gods who had supposedly endorsed her rule had actually condemned her, that her true nature was servitude rather than sovereignty. The fourth stage was religious. Captured queens were often dedicated to Assyrian gods, particularly to Ashur, the chief god, and to Ishtar, the goddess who combined war and sexuality in ways that made her perfect for this purpose. Temple records mention foreign women serving in various capacities, from maintaining temple spaces to participating in rituals whose specific nature remains unclear but that contemporaries considered significant enough to record their presence. This religious dedication served multiple purposes. It claimed that the Assyrian gods had accepted these women as legitimate offerings. It transformed military conquest into religious victory. And it ensured that even in their degradation, these women served Assyrian purposes, their very existence reinforcing the ideology that Assyria's wars were divinely approved. The fifth stage was architectural. Captured queens lived in the Bit Ashirati, the women's quarters, for the rest of their lives. These spaces were designed specifically for control. High walls, limited access points guarded by internal layouts that made escape impossible and that allowed constant surveillance. Windows that looked inward to courtyards rather than outward to the city. The Bit Ashirati was simultaneously palace and prison, a space where women lived in material comfort but in complete isolation from the outside world and from any possibility of independence or agency. The excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh have revealed the physical layout of these spaces, large complexes adjacent to but separate from the main palace, multiple courtyards, dozens of small rooms, ritual spaces with basins and altars, storage areas filled with the kinds of luxury goods that would be distributed to palace women, fine fabrics and cosmetics, and jewelry that marked status within the captive hierarchy but that also marked their collective status as property of the palace. And overseeing all of this were the men who had themselves been captured and castrated, who had been raised in the palace system, who understood submission because they had experienced it, who enforced control with the zeal of those who had internalized their own degradation, and who now exercised the limited power available to them by managing others whose status was even lower. The eunuchs were perfect enforcers for this system, because they could never threaten the king through producing heirs, because they had no external loyalties that might compromise their service, and because they knew exactly how to break women who resisted, because they themselves had been broken and remade by the same system. Now let me tell you in detail what happened to one specific woman, how this system worked in practice, how all these elements came together to destroy a queen and transform her into anonymous property. Let me tell you the story of the Elamite queen whose fate became legendary even among a people accustomed to conquest, and whose treatment demonstrates everything that made the Assyrian system both effective and monstrous. Elam was an ancient kingdom in what is now southwestern Iran. It had existed for more than 2,000 years before Assyria rose to prominence, with its own language and culture and religious traditions that differed significantly from Mesopotamian norms. Elam's capital at Susa was one of the great cities of the ancient Near East, wealthy from trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau and beyond. For centuries, Elam had been a rival to Babylonian and Assyrian power, sometimes allied with them, sometimes at war, always maintaining independence and dignity as one of the region's major kingdoms. But in 647 before Christ, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal launched a massive campaign against Elam. The war was brutal, even by Assyrian standards. Ashurbanipal's inscriptions boast about the destruction he inflicted. Cities burned, populations slaughtered or deported. The royal tombs at Susa were desecrated. The bones of previous Elamite kings were scattered as the ultimate humiliation. And when the Elamite capital fell, Ashurbanipal captured the royal family, including King Toman and his queen. The Assyrian palace reliefs from Nineveh show what happened next in remarkable and disturbing detail. Teoman was killed in battle or shortly after capture, his head cut off and displayed prominently. One famous relief shows his severed head being carried to Ashurbanipal during a victory banquet, hanging from a tree while the Assyrian king and his queen recline on elaborate couches, eating and drinking and celebrating conquest while musicians play and servants attend them, and the dead king's head watches from its grotesque position. But Teoman's queen, whose name the Assyrian records deliberately do not preserve, was taken alive. The reliefs show her kneeling before Ashur, her posture indicating submission or pleading, her royal clothing still visible but her status clearly degraded. This was the moment of maximum humiliation, the public demonstration that Elam's royal family had lost everything, that their gods had abandoned them, that Assyrian power was absolute and unchallengeable. Then the Elamite queen disappeared from the public record. The inscriptions that describe Ashurbanipal's triumph over Elam mention her capture but not her subsequent fate. She was transported to Nineveh, presumably with other members of the Elamite royal household who had been taken captive. And somewhere in the palace complex, she underwent the transformation process that would turn her from Queen of Elam into property of the Assyrian palace system. Later sources, particularly Greek writers like Ctesias, who had access to Persian archives that preserved memories of Assyrian practices, mention rumors about what happened to prominent captive queens. These accounts are problematic as historical sources because they were written centuries after the events, and because Greek writers often exaggerated or misunderstood practices from cultures they considered barbaric, but the rumors they recorded suggest that even centuries later, people remembered the Assyrian treatment of captured queens as exceptional in its cruelty and in its systematic destruction of dignity. One persistent rumor claimed that the Elam queen was paraded naked through Nineveh with her body painted gold, representing the sun god's victory over her kingdom's gods. Whether this actually happened or represents symbolic interpretation of religious imagery remains debated. But the story itself suggests that contemporaries believed Assyrian treatment of this particular queen went beyond routine captivity into territory that was remembered as shocking, even by ancient standards that accepted brutal treatment of defeated enemies as normal. What seems more certain, based on administrative records and archaeological evidence, is that the Elamite queen was processed through the standard transformation ritual. Her name was erased from official records and replaced with an Assyrian designation. She was assigned to serve in some capacity within the palace complex, possibly in temple service, given her high status and the Assyrian practice of dedicating prominent captives to gods as demonstrations of divine approval for conquest. She lived out her remaining years, perhaps decades, in the Bit Ash, under constant surveillance by eunuchs who ensured she could never communicate with the outside world or take any action that might challenge Assyrian authority. She died in Assyria, far from her homeland. She was buried somewhere in the palace complex or its vicinity, probably without markers that would identify her original identity. When archaeologists excavated the tombs at Nimrud in the 20th century, they found female skeletons wearing elaborate jewelry from multiple different regions, including pieces that were identifiably Elamite in style. One of these women may have been Tehumen's queen, but we will never know for certain, because the Assyrians deliberately erased the evidence that would allow us to identify specific individuals, because the whole point of the system was to transform queens into anonymous property whose individual identities ceased to matter. The psychological destruction involved in this process cannot be overstated. Imagine being a queen having commanded servants and issued decrees and represented your kingdom to foreign powers. Then, in a matter of days or weeks, your kingdom falls. Your husband is killed. You are taken captive and transported to the enemy capital. You are stripped of your clothing and jewelry and royal insignia. Your name is literally erased. You are given a new name that has no connection to your family or homeland. You are put to work at menial tasks or assigned to serve gods. You were taught to consider false. You are locked in a palace complex that you can never leave. You are surrounded by guards who have been specifically trained to prevent resistance or escape. And you live like this for years, for decades, until you die and are buried without markers that record who you really were. This was the fate of the Elamite queen, and she was not unique or exceptional. Dozens of other queens and hundreds of princesses and royal daughters, similar treatment. During the 3 centuries of Assyrian imperial dominance, every major conquest produced new captives for the palace system. Every rebellion that was crushed resulted in royal families being transported to Assyria. And all of these women disappeared into a system designed to erase them systematically and completely. The Bit Asherati, the Assyrian royal harem, was not simply a collection of the king's wives and concubines, as the term harem might suggest to modern readers. It was a comprehensive system of control and management for hundreds of women from diverse backgrounds whose only common feature was that they had lost all agency and had become property of the palace. Understanding how this system functioned requires looking at its physical layout, its hierarchical structure, its rules and punishments, and the role of the eunuchs who managed it. The physical spaces of the Bit Asherati were designed with control as the primary architectural principle. The women's quarters at Nimrud and Nineveh were built as walled compounds within the larger palace complex. Access was through a single heavily guarded gate. Internal layouts featured multiple courtyards surrounded by rooms, creating a maze-like structure where movement could be controlled and monitored. Windows faced inward to courtyards rather than outward to the city, preventing any visual contact with the world beyond the walls. The high walls themselves, often 20 feet or higher, made escape physically impossible. Even if a woman somehow got past the guards, within these physical spaces lived a carefully stratified population. At the top of the hierarchy were the king's actual wives, women from powerful Assyrian families whose marriages sealed political alliances within the empire. These women had relative freedom within the Bit Asherati, maintained their own servants, and wielded significant influence over palace politics. Below them were favored concubines, women who had pleased the king sexually or socially and who received material rewards and slightly elevated status as a result. But the vast majority of women in the Bit Asherati occupied lower positions in the hierarchy, captured foreign queens and princesses, daughters of vassal kings sent as tribute or hostages, women acquired through military conquest whose origins ranged from major kingdoms to minor city-states, women assigned to serve in temples adjacent to the palace, women whose specific roles involved weaving or cooking or maintaining palace spaces, women who had been dedicated to the gods, which could mean anything from temple service to sexual availability for priests or high officials. The administrative tablets from Assyrian palace archives reveal this hierarchy through careful record-keeping. Women were categorized by origin, by status, by function. Rations were distributed according to rank. clothing and jewelry and cosmetics were assigned as rewards or punishments. Even hairstyles and veiling practices were regulated to ensure that status was always visible, that everyone knew their place in the system. The rules governing life in the Bit Ashieti were strict and comprehensive. Women could not leave the compound without explicit permission, which was rarely granted. They could not communicate with men outside the eunuch staff, except in carefully controlled circumstances. They could not speak freely, even among themselves. Conversations were monitored, and anything that sounded like criticism of the king or discussion of palace politics or reminiscence about life before captivity could be punished. They could not possess metal objects that might be used as weapons or tools for escape. They had to maintain ritual purity according to Assyrian religious standards, which included regular ceremonial washing and adherence to dietary and behavioral restrictions. Violations of these rules brought swift punishment. The Nimrod Letters, a collection of correspondence between palace officials from the 7th century before Christ, mention various disciplinary measures. Women accused of improper speech could be whipped or isolated in darkness. Women suspected of impure conduct could be subjected to ritual purification that functioned as punishment. Women caught attempting escape or communication with outsiders faced execution, though the letters use euphemisms like sent to the house of confinement or dedicated to Ashur, that probably meant death. Presented as religious sacrifice. One letter mentions a woman being punished for speaking the names of the old gods, meaning she had been heard praying to the deities of her homeland rather than to Assyrian gods. Her punishment was to have her tongue pierced with a heated needle, a physical modification that would make speech painful and difficult, while serving as a permanent reminder that she was forbidden from invoking gods that Assyria had conquered. Whether this specific incident occurred as described or represents the kind of punishment that palace officials considered appropriate, the letter demonstrates the totalitarian control that the Bit Ashieti system exerted over every aspect of women's lives, including their private thoughts and prayers. The enforcement of this system depended entirely on the eunuch. These men captured and castrated as boys or young men, raised within the palace system, trained specifically to manage the royal women, were the key to making the Bit Ashieti function as intended. They understood submission because they had experienced it. They had no external loyalties because they had been taken from their homelands and families so young that they had no meaningful connections outside the palace. They could be trusted with access to royal women because their castration meant they posed no sexual or reproductive threat to the king's exclusive rights. The eunuchs developed elaborate protocols for managing the women under their control. They conducted regular inspections to ensure rules were being followed. They assigned work and distributed rations, and determined which women received rewards and which received punishments. They investigated accusations of rule violations and recommended disciplinary measures to higher palace officials. They maintained records of each woman's origin, status, behavior, and fate. And crucially, the eunuchs served as the only human connection these women had to the world outside their confined spaces. They brought news, though carefully filtered to prevent anything that might encourage hope of rescue or change. They conveyed the king's commands and desires. They arranged the rare occasions when foreign women might be brought before the king or high officials for inspection or service. They were simultaneously captors and the only people with whom most of these women could have any regular human interaction. The psychological dynamic created by this arrangement was complex and toxic. Eunuchs who had themselves been victimized by the system now enforced it on others. They wielded the limited power available to them with the thoroughness of people who understood exactly how vulnerable their position was, who knew that any failure in controlling the women under their supervision could result in their own punishment or execution. Some eunuchs were cruel beyond what the system required, taking out their own trauma and resentment on women who had even less power. Others maintained professional distance, treating their role as purely administrative. A few apparently developed sympathetic relationships with individual captive women. Though always within the strict boundaries that the system imposed, The palace women learned quickly that survival meant absolute compliance. Resistance brought punishment. Attempts to maintain cultural or religious identity from their homelands brought correction. Even private grief about their situations was dangerous if expressed, where it might be overheard and reported. So they adapted. They conformed outwardly while maintaining whatever internal resistance they could manage. They learned the language and customs of their captors. They participated in Assyrian religious ceremonies even while perhaps praying privately to their own gods. They accepted new names and new roles and the reality that their previous lives had ended permanently. But this adaptation came at tremendous psychological cost. Modern trauma research recognizes that captivity situations involving total control, isolation from support networks, and forced participation in the captor's systems produce profound damage to identity and psychological functioning. The palace women in the Bit. The palace women in the Bit Assyrians experienced all of these conditions in extreme form, sustained not for months but for years or decades. The resulting trauma would have affected every aspect of their functioning, producing what we would now recognize as complex PTSD, learned helplessness, identity fragmentation, and numerous other psychological conditions that had no names in the ancient world, but that were no less real for being unrecognized. Archaeological evidence suggests that life expectancy in the Bit Assyrians was relatively short, despite material comfort. The female skeletons found in palace area burials show high rates of nutritional deficiency despite food rations that should have been adequate, suggesting that chronic stress affected physical health. They show injuries consistent with physical punishment or so. They show ages at death that cluster in the 20s and 30s rather than the 40s and 50s. That would have been normal for aristocratic women in the ancient world. The Bit Assyrians was slowly fatal even when it did not kill quickly, but the Assyrian system for controlling captured queens involved more than the routine degradations of the Bit Assyrians. There was another level, a deeper form of punishment reserved for women who were considered particularly dangerous, or who came from kingdoms that the Assyrians wanted to destroy utterly. This was the Bit Kili, translated sometimes as the House of Confinement, or House of Silence, a prison within the palace complex where women could be isolated completely from all human contact except for the guards who kept them alive. References to the Bit Kili appear in administrative tablets, but always obliquely, using euphemisms or indirect language that suggests the place and what happened there were not to be discussed openly, even in official records. Women were sent to the House of Confinement, or given to the Silence, or placed in the keeping of Oshur, which probably all meant the same thing. Total isolation in underground cells where they could not communicate with anyone and where they would remain until they died or until they were judged sufficiently broken that they could be returned to the general population of the Bit Assyrians. Archaeological exploration of the palace complexes at Nin and Nimrod has identified spaces that may have served this function. Underground chambers accessible only through narrow passages, small rooms carved into bedrock with no windows and minimal ventilation, spaces where someone could be kept alive but completely isolated from sensory stimulation or human contact. Whether these spaces actually served as prisons for aristocratic women or whether they had other functions remains debated among archaeologists. But the administrative references to a house of confinement, combined with these physical spaces that could serve no obvious purpose except isolation, suggests that such a system existed. The psychological effects of solitary confinement are well documented in modern research. Even short periods of complete isolation produce cognitive impairment, hallucinations, severe anxiety, and long-term psychological damage. Prolonged isolation lasting months or years essentially destroys the mind, producing effects that are irreversible even if the person is eventually released. The Assyrians may not have understood the specific mechanisms by which isolation damages the brain, but they clearly understood that it was an extremely effective punishment that could break even the strongest-willed individuals who would have been sent to the Bit Kili. Women who resisted transformation, women who attempted escape, women who were caught trying to communicate with outsiders or plotting resistance, women from particularly important kingdoms whose destruction the Assyrians wanted to emphasize, women who represented such symbolic threats that even the routine degradations of the Bit Ashidi seemed insufficient. One fragmentary tablet mentions a queen from a kingdom identified only as the land of the setting sun, probably meaning somewhere in Anatolia or the Levantu, was given to the silence after she was heard speaking against the king's gods repeatedly, despite previous punishments. The tablet records that she was kept in the Bitkili for 3 years before her death, implying that she was literally kept in isolation for that entire period. 3 years of solitary confinement would have destroyed her mind completely long before it destroyed her body. This was not punishment designed to correct behavior. This was punishment designed to destroy a person utterly while keeping them technically alive. Another tablet refers to the daughters of the king of Urartu who were placed in the keeping of Ashur after their father rebelled against Assyrian authority. Urartu was a powerful kingdom in the mountains north of Assyria that repeatedly challenged Assyrian expansion. When Urartian resistance was finally crushed, the king's daughters were apparently not just captured but isolated in the Bitkili as a demonstration of what happened to royal families who opposed Assyrian power. Whether they survived this treatment or died in isolation is not recorded. The Bitkili served multiple purposes within the broader system of control. It provided an ultimate threat that ensured compliance among the broader population of palace women. It demonstrated that even royal birth provided no protection against total destruction if a woman challenged Assyrian authority, and it satisfied what seems to have been a genuine Assyrian belief that some enemies were so dangerous or so offensive to the gods that their mere continued existence was a threat that required complete isolation from the world. But isolation was not the only enhanced punishment available to Assyrian authorities. Palace records also hint at other methods of ensuring compliance and destroying resistance. Women could be forced to witness the execution of other captives, creating trauma bonding and demonstrating the consequences of disobedience. They could be subjected to physical mutilations that marked their bodies permanently with evidence of punishment, particularly facial mutilations that destroyed beauty and made clear that they would never again be presentable in any public context. They could be dedicated to the gods in ways that apparently involved more than simple temple service. This last phrase appears repeatedly in tablets, but always without elaboration, suggesting that dedication to the gods meant something that scribes did not want to record explicitly. Some historians interpret it as a euphemism for execution presented as religious sacrifice. Others suggest it might have involved assignment to temple prostitution or similar sexualized religious service. Still others propose it might have meant being buried alive in foundation deposits when new temple buildings were constructed, a practice that some archaeological evidence suggests may have occurred. Though direct proof remains elusive, what seems certain is that dedication to the gods was permanent and fatal. Women who were dedicated never reappear in administrative records. They vanish completely from documentation, as though they never existed. This pattern of disappearance suggests that whatever happened to these women was final, and that recording the specific details was considered either too sacred or too shameful to commit to clay tablets that might be read by future generations. Now, I need to tell you about specific women whose stories we can partially reconstruct from the fragmentary evidence that survives, not just the anonymous masses who disappeared into the palace system, but individuals whose names or circumstances were recorded in enough detail that we can understand them as people rather than as statistics. These stories reveal the human reality behind the administrative abstractions, showing how the system worked in practice and what it cost the women who experienced it. The first is a woman whose original name is lost but who appears in the letters under the Assyrian designation Melissu Damkat, meaning Melissu is good, referring to the goddess Melissu, who was Ashur's consort. The letters identify her as formerly of the House of Babylon, meaning she was from Babylonian royalty, captured during one of the many conflicts between Assyria and its southern neighbor. The specific circumstances of her capture are not recorded, but she appears in correspondence from around 690 before Christ during the reign of St. The letters mention Melissa Domkat multiple times in contexts that suggest she was considered problematic by palace authorities. She is accused of speaking with improper passion and of failing to show proper reverence. She is apparently suspected of attempting to communicate with someone outside the palace, though the letters don't specify how this communication might have been attempted or with whom she was trying to communicate. One letter recommends that she be corrected severely and placed under increased surveillance. Then there is a gap in the correspondence. Melissa Domkat is not mentioned again for more than a year. When she reappears, the context has changed completely. She is now described as obedient and properly silent. She has been assigned to work in temple service, grinding grain for offerings to Ashur. The transformation suggests that the severe correction worked as intended, breaking whatever resistance she had shown and producing the kind of compliant behavior that the system required. But the letters also mention that Melissa Domkat attempted suicide shortly after being reassigned to temple service. She apparently tried to strangle herself using cloth from her own clothing but was discovered by guards before succeeding. Her punishment for this attempt was to be placed in restraints and kept under constant observation, effectively ending any possibility of privacy or any future suicide attempt. She lived at least another 2 years in this state, appearing occasionally in ration lists that show she was receiving minimum food allocations, appropriate for her status as a punished captive rather than normal rations. The last mention of Melissa Domkat states simply that she has been given to the service of the gods, the euphemistic phrase that probably meant execution. Whether this was punishment for the suicide attempt or whether she died naturally, and the phrase was simply the standard way of recording the death of a temple servant, remains unclear. But her story illustrates the trajectory that many captured royal women experienced: resistance, punishment, attempted compliance, psychological breakdown, death. The second woman whose story we can partially reconstruct appears in Annals from the reign of Esarhaddon, who ruled from 681 to 669 before Christ. She is identified as the sister of the king of Sidon, captured when Esarhaddon destroyed that Phoenician city after it rebelled against Assyrian authority. Sidon was a major maritime trading city, wealthy and culturally sophisticated, with ancient traditions that dated back more than 1,000 years. Its destruction by Esarhaddon was thorough and brutal, killing the king and enslaving the population and literally drowning the city's patron gods by throwing their statues into the sea. The princess of Sidon, whose name the Assyrian records did not preserve, was transported to Nineveh along with other captives. But rather than simply being processed through the standard transformation ritual and assigned to the Bit Ashiti, she was apparently selected for special treatment. The annals mention that she was made to serve at the royal table, meaning she was forced to serve food and wine during royal banquets, performing tasks that a princess would have commanded servants to do, visible to all guests as a demonstration of how completely Assyria had conquered her city and degraded her status. This public humiliation continued for an unspecified period. Then, the princess disappears from the annals, but she reappears in a very different context. Archaeological excavations at Nineveh in the 19th century discovered relief panels from Issa palace that showed tribute and captives from various conquered regions. One panel shows women from Phoenician cities, identifiable by their clothing and hairstyles. Among them is a woman who appears more prominently than the others, shown kneeling before an Assyrian official in a posture that combines submission with apparent pleading. Some archaeologists have suggested this figure might be the princess of Sidon, depicted at the moment when she was being assigned to temple service, or possibly when she was being sentenced to some other fate. The relief shows her with bound hands, and with her head bowed, a stark contrast to the dignified royal posture she would have maintained in her previous life. Whether this identification is correct remains debated, but it illustrates how Assyrian visual propaganda used images of captured royal women to communicate the totality of their conquests. The third woman's story is documented primarily through Greek sources, particularly Cesus, whose credibility is questionable, but whose account preserves traditions that may have originated in authentic Persian records. He describes a princess from Elam, who was captured during one of Ashurbanipal's campaigns, but who was not immediately killed or processed into the palace system. Instead, she was kept as a potential bargaining chip, possibly to be used in negotiations, or possibly because Ashurbanipal was considering a political marriage that would give him claims to Elamite territory. But this princess apparently refused to cooperate with Assyrian plans. According to Ctesias, she repeatedly declared that she would never acknowledge Assyrian gods as legitimate, and that she remained loyal to Elamite deities even in captivity. This defiance continued despite punishments and threats. Eventually, Ashurbanipal reportedly ordered that she be executed, but in a manner that would demonstrate the consequences of religious defiance. She was to be dedicated to Ashur in a ceremony that Ctesias describes in language that suggests human sacrifice. Though his account is so colored by Greek assumptions about barbaric practices that extracting historical truth from rhetorical embellishment is nearly impossible. What we can say is that if this story has any basis in fact, it illustrates that some captured queens chose death over submission, that maintaining religious and cultural identity mattered enough to them that they would accept execution rather than participate in Assyrian religious ceremonies or acknowledge the legitimacy of Assyrian gods. Whether many women made this choice or whether most complied in order to survive, we cannot know from the fragmentary evidence that remains. The fourth story comes from later Babylonian chronicles written after the fall of Assyria, which had incentive to exaggerate Assyrian cruelty but which also preserved memories of specific incidents. One chronicle mentions a queen from an Aramean kingdom in Syria who was captured by Tiglath-Pileser III during his western campaigns in the 8th century. This queen was apparently pregnant at the time of her capture. The chronicle claims that Tiglath ordered that she be kept alive until she gave birth, then had the child killed in front of her before giving her to the house of women, meaning the bit as. If this account is accurate, it represents a level of calculated cruelty that goes beyond even the routine degradations of the system. Keeping a pregnant woman alive, specifically so that her child could be killed, as additional punishment demonstrates psychological torture that seems excessive even by ancient standards of brutality toward defeated enemies. But it also illustrates Assyrian understanding of how to inflict maximum psychological damage, how to destroy hope completely, how to ensure that captured queens understood that nothing they valued would be protected or preserved. These individual stories, fragmentary and incomplete as they are, reveal the human reality behind the administrative systems and the royal inscriptions and the archaeological remains. Each woman had a history, a family, a homeland, an identity that mattered to her. Each was violently removed from everything familiar and forced into a system designed specifically to destroy who she had been and replace it with anonymous servitude. Some resisted, some complied, some broke psychologically, some maintained internal resistance while conforming outwardly, but all of them lost everything that had given meaning to their lives before. Assyrian conquest. Now we need to address directly the role that religion played in this system, because understanding the Assyrian treatment of captured queens requires understanding how they used religious ideology to justify practices that violated every principle of sacred kingship that ancient Near Eastern cultures claimed to honor. The Assyrian state religion centered on the god Ashur, conceived as a divine king who ruled the heavenly realm, just as the Assyrian king ruled the earthly realm. Assyrian military campaigns were not simply political or economic ventures, but religious crusades, wars waged on behalf of Ashur to bring rebellious peoples and their false gods under proper divine authority. When the Assyrian king conquered a foreign kingdom, he was not just defeating human enemies, but demonstrating that Ashur was more powerful than the gods those enemies worshipped. This ideology had profound implications for how captured royalty was treated. Foreign kings and queens had claimed divine sanction for their rule, had presented themselves as chosen by their gods to govern their peoples. Their defeat demonstrated that this claim was false. that their gods were either powerless or had withdrawn support. The Assyrians made this point explicit through their treatment of divine images. They would seize statues of conquered people's gods and transport them to Assyria, literally kidnapping the divine beings and making them serve Assyrian purposes. This was not simply trophy taking, but a theological statement. Your gods are now prisoners, just like you are, and they serve our gods, just as you serve our king. Captured queens fit into this ideology as living demonstrations of religious truth. Their degradation proved that the gods they had worshipped had abandoned them. Their forced participation in Assyrian religious ceremonies demonstrated that even enemy royalty acknowledged Assyrian divine superiority. Their assignment to serve in Assyrian temples showed that Ashur had accepted them as legitimate offerings, that their previous religious identity was erased just as completely as their political and personal identity. But there was another religious dimension to the treatment of captured queens that made the system particularly disturbing. This involved the goddess Ishtar, known also as Inanna, who combined warfare and sexuality in ways that no other major deity did. Ishtar was the patron of both military conquest and erotic love, of violence and fertility, of death and life. Her temples involved practices that other cultures found shocking, particularly temple prostitution, where women served the goddess through providing sexual services to temple visitors. The Assyrians seem to have consciously connected their treatment of captured queens to Ishtar worship. Some administrative tablets refer to foreign women being dedicated to Ishtar, a phrase that appears in contexts suggesting these women were assigned to serve in Ishtar temples in capacities that combined religious service with sexual availability. The conflation of military conquest with sexual domination was not unique to Assyria, but the Assyrians systematized it and gave it religious sanction in ways that made it particularly comprehensive and particularly destructive to the women experiencing it. Modern scholars debate the extent to which ancient Near Eastern temple prostitution actually existed as a widespread institution versus how much it was exaggerated by Greek and later writers who misunderstood or deliberately distorted religious practices they found alien. But what seems clear is that captured foreign women were assigned to temples in some capacity that contemporaries distinguished from normal temple service, that involved their sexuality in ways considered significant enough to record, and that was understood as a form of dedication to the goddess that permanently removed these women from any possibility of normal life. The archaeological evidence for this comes from several sources. Temple complexes associated with Ishtar worship include large residential areas, suggesting that many people lived there permanently. Administrative tablets from these temples list rations for women of foreign lands in quantities suggesting dozens or hundreds of such women. Attached to individual temple complexes, and inscriptions from Ishtar temples occasionally mention the gift of the king, referring to dedications made by the monarch, which in some contexts clearly means women rather than inanimate objects. What makes this particularly disturbing is how it combined religious justification with psychological destruction. Women who had been queens, who had held religious authority in their own right as representatives of their kingdom's gods, were forced not just to acknowledge defeat but to participate actively in the worship of gods they had been raised to consider enemies or false. They had to perform religious services, possibly including sexualized services in temples dedicated to the goddess who represented the very conquests that had destroyed their lives. The psychological violence of this forced participation cannot be overstated. Some women apparently resisted, even at the cost of their lives. The administrative correspondence mentions women who refused to participate in temple ceremonies, who continued to pray to their homeland gods despite punishment, who had to be physically forced to perform required rituals. These women were punished severely, but their resistance demonstrates that religious identity mattered profoundly, that maintaining connection to their own gods was worth suffering for, even when it could not change their practical circumstances. But most women probably complied outwardly, while maintaining whatever internal resistance they could manage. They performed the required ceremonies. They learned Assyrian prayers and hymns. They participated in festivals and rituals. But whether they truly accepted Assyrian gods as legitimate or whether they maintained private devotion to their own deities while going through the motions of Assyrian worship, we cannot know. The administrative records document compliance but cannot reveal what these women actually believed or felt. The Assyrian system for controlling captured queens functioned effectively for 3 centuries, from approximately 900 to 612 before Christ. During that time, dozens of kingdoms fell to Assyrian conquest. Hundreds of royal families were destroyed or scattered, and thousands of aristocratic women disappeared into the palace and temple. Systems. The machinery of degradation and control operated with systematic efficiency, processing new captives regularly and disposing of those who died or who were executed for resistance. But the system was fundamentally dependent on Assyrian military dominance. As long as Assyrian armies were invincible, as long as rebellions were crushed quickly and decisively, as long as no external power could challenge Assyrian control of the Near East, the system of terror and degradation worked as intended. But military dominance could not be sustained forever, and when it failed, when the Assyrian military system collapsed, revenge came swiftly and thoroughly. The end began in the late 7th century before Christ. A coalition of enemies including Babylonians and Medes and Scythians joined forces to attack Assyria. The campaigns were brutal, matching Assyrian ruthlessness with equal savagery. Assyrian cities fell one by one. Ashur, the ancient capital, was captured and destroyed. Nimrod burned. And in 612 before Christ, Nineveh itself, the greatest city in the Near East, the capital that had seemed invulnerable, fell to the coalition armies after a siege lasting months. The destruction of Nineveh was thorough and deliberate. The attackers were not interested in occupying the city or preserving its wealth. They wanted to erase it, to destroy it so completely that it would never rise again. To exact revenge for 3 centuries of Assyrian atrocities, the city burned for weeks. The palace complexes were systematically demolished. The population was slaughtered, and the royal family, including the women of the Bit Ashurti, experienced the same fate that Assyrian kings had inflicted on so many others. Later, Babylonian chronicles describe what happened to the Assyrian royal women with satisfaction that borders on glee. The women who had lived in luxury while overseeing a system that destroyed captured foreign queens were now themselves subjected to similar treatment. They were taken captive. They were paraded through the streets of conquered cities. They were assigned to serve in temples. They experienced the same degradations, the same erasure of identity, the same forced submission that their predecessors had inflicted on so many others. Some were executed immediately as revenge for Assyrian crimes. Others were kept alive, but enslaved. Still others were dedicated to the gods in ceremonies that echoed the same euphemistic phrases that Assyrian administrators had used when disposing of foreign captives. The Bit Ashurti was emptied. The women who had lived there as Assyrian queens or as favored concubines or as administrators of the system found themselves experiencing the plus system from the other side, learning firsthand what it felt like to be property rather than persons. The Babylonian chronicles describe one particularly symbolic act of revenge. The body of the last Assyrian king was apparently desecrated, his head displayed publicly in Babylon in the same way that Assyrian kings had displayed the heads of defeated enemies, and his chief queen was forced to serve at the victory banquet celebrating Babylon's triumph, made to stand behind the Babylonian king, offering wine and food to guests who toasted the destruction of Assyria and the justice of divine revenge. Whether this specific incident occurred exactly as described or represents literary invention designed to emphasize the completeness of Babylon's victory remains debated. But the basic pattern is clear. The systems that Assyria had built to control and degrade captured royalty were turned against Assyrian royalty themselves. When military power shifted, the women who had benefited from or administered or simply survived within the Assyrian palace system experienced the same fate that system had inflicted on so many Others. The archaeological record confirms the violence of Nineveh's fall. Excavations show extensive burning throughout the palace complexes. Mass graves contain victims of the final siege and sack, and in the areas identified as the Bit Ashirta, the women's quarters, archaeologists found skeletal remains showing evidence of violent death, suggesting that many palace women were killed during the final assault rather than being taken captive and processed into new captivity systems. Nineveh was never rebuilt. The city that had been the greatest in the world became ruins, gradually buried under dirt and forgotten. Its location was lost for more than 2,000 years until 19th century archaeologists rediscovered it and began excavating the palace complexes. Those excavations revealed the splendor of Assyrian architecture and art, the sophistication of their administrative systems, the extent of their imperial ambitions, but they also revealed the darker realities, the systematic cruelty, the instruments of control and degradation, the evidence of what happened to the women who disappeared into the palace system. So what should we make of the Assyrian treatment of captured queens after examining the evidence in detail? Were these practices simply normal by the standards of their time? Or did they represent extremes that contemporaries themselves recognized as exceptional? Was the system primarily about practical control of potentially dangerous political rivals? Or was it about psychological domination and the deliberate destruction of human dignity? And how should we judge a system that operated with such systematic efficiency for so long without producing the kind of resistance or moral questioning that we might expect if it genuinely violated shared ancient values? The honest answer is complex and uncomfortable. The Assyrians were not unique in treating defeated enemies brutally or in taking captives as slaves. Every ancient Near Eastern power practiced forms of slavery, treated defeated enemy leaders violently, and claimed divine sanction for their military conquests. The basic structure of taking captives and reducing them to servitude was universal, but the Assyrian system went beyond these common practices in several ways that made it distinctive and distinctively cruel even by ancient standards. First, it was systematic rather than opportunistic. The Assyrians created comprehensive institutions specifically designed to process captured royalty, with standardized procedures, administrative oversight, and architectural spaces purpose-built for control and degradation. This was not casual brutality but organized, rationalized, bureaucratized destruction of human dignity. Second, it was designed specifically to destroy identity rather than simply to punish or control. The erasure of names, the forced religious conversions, the assignment to tasks that inverted previous status, all of these elements were calculated to destroy who these women had been and replace it with nothing except anonymous servitude. The goal was not just physical control, but psychological annihilation. Third, it operated on a scale that exceeded other ancient practices. We are talking about centuries of continuous operation, hundreds of women processed through the system, entire aristocratic classes from multiple kingdoms eliminated or absorbed. The comprehensiveness of the system suggests that destroying captured queens was not a side effect of military conquest, but was actually central to how Assyria maintained imperial dominance. Fourth, and perhaps most disturbing, it was the Assyrians documented their system extensively, recorded their procedures, created visual representations in palace reliefs that showed captured queens in submission. They were not embarrassed about what they were doing or trying to hide it. They broadcast it as a demonstration of power and as a warning to potential enemies. The only things they did not document were the specific details of transformation ceremonies and certain punishments, suggesting that even by their own standards, some of what they did went beyond what could be openly recorded. The question of how contemporary cultures viewed Assyrian practices is difficult to answer definitively. The written sources that survive are either Assyrian texts that present official perspectives, or texts written by Assyria's enemies after its fall that had incentive to exaggerate atrocities. We have almost no neutral contemporary commentary, but the fact that when Assyria fell, revenge was extracted so thoroughly, that Nineveh was destroyed so completely, that Babylonian chronicles celebrated the destruction, with such evident satisfaction. This suggests that Assyria's practices were remembered as exceptional and deserving of exceptional punishment. Later, Jewish and Christian writers preserved memories of Assyrian cruelty, using Nineveh as a symbol of evil empire and divine judgment. The biblical book of Nahum celebrates the city's destruction with language that emphasizes how Assyria's victims rejoiced at its fall. The book of Jonah, though earlier, presents Nineveh as a place of such comprehensive wickedness that God considered destroying it completely. These later religious interpretations may not reflect actual historical memory accurately, but they suggest that cultures that preserved traditions about Assyria remembered it as particularly cruel and its destruction as particularly just. Modern scholars recognize that judging ancient practices by modern ethical standards is problematic because it ignores historical context and cultural differences, but they also recognize that some practices violated principles that were shared across ancient cultures. That not everything that happened in the ancient world can be excused as simply different cultural norms. The systematic destruction of identity, the torture of captives, the use of religious justification for practices that served no practical purpose. Beyond psychological domination, these go beyond cultural relativism into territory that most ethical frameworks, ancient or modern, would condemn. What the Assyrians did to captured queens was not just cruel but calculated cruelty, designed to destroy not just individuals but the legitimacy of entire dynasties. Not just to control, but to erase, not just to punish, but to demonstrate that some enemies were so thoroughly defeated that even their memory would be obliterated. The women who experienced this system lost everything. Not just their freedom or their status, but their very identities, their names, their connections to homelands and families and gods. They became anonymous property whose individual histories ceased to matter except as entries in administrative records that documented their processing and control. And when we stand in the ruins of Nineveh today, when we see the excavated palace complexes and the reconstructed reliefs showing captive queens kneeling in submission, when we read the administrative tablets that recorded rations and punishments, and the disposal of women who died or were executed, we are witnessing evidence of a system that functioned with bureaucratic efficiency for 3 centuries, destroying hundreds of lives, erasing identities, demonstrating that human dignity can be systematically eliminated when power is absolute and when cruelty is rationalized as political necessity or religious duty. The legacy of what the Assyrians did remains relevant not because we face identical situations today, but because the patterns they exemplified continue. The use of systematic degradation to break resistance, the destruction of identity as a form of control, the rationalization of cruelty through claims of necessity or divine sanction, the targeting of women specifically because they represent symbolic threats to male power structures. These patterns appear throughout history in different forms, affecting how we understand power and its abuses, how we recognize systems of control, how we judge claims that certain practices are justified by circumstances or by higher purposes. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most disturbing systems of control fascinating and want to learn more about how power has been abused throughout history and how we can recognize similar patterns in different contexts, then subscribe right now. Hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you don't miss future videos about historical systems of oppression and control and the evidence they left behind. Share this video with anyone interested in ancient history or in understanding how human rights violations occur systematically rather than just individually. Remember these women not as statistics in administrative records, but as individuals who lost everything, who experienced comprehensive destruction of identity and dignity, who survived or did not survive in a system designed specifically to erase them. Remember that the archaeological evidence we have, the palace complexes and the reliefs, and the tablets and the skeletal remains all represent real human suffering that occurred systematically for centuries. And remember that understanding how such systems functioned helps us recognize warning signs when similar patterns emerge in different contexts. The ruins of Nineveh still stand in northern Iraq, largely unexcavated. holding secrets that may never be fully recovered. The Bit Ashirdi and the Bit Kili and the transformation chambers exist now only as archaeological features, spaces that held horror for the women who passed through them, but that appear now as mere architectural elements requiring interpretation. The women themselves, the captured queens, whose names were erased, and whose paternities were destroyed, exist now only as fragmentary entries in administrative records, and as anonymous skeletons wearing jewelry, from kingdoms that disappeared 3,000 years ago. But their suffering was real. The system that destroyed them was real. And the lessons we can learn from studying that system, understanding how it functioned, and why it operated with such efficiency for so long, and what finally ended its these lessons remain relevant for understanding power and cruelty and the systematic destruction of human dignity in any era, including our own. See you in the next video, where we will continue exploring the dark corners of history that reveal uncomfortable truths about power and control, and how civilizations create systems that destroy the very people they claim to rule justly.